On a Saturday morning in 1871, in the dust-white square of Carrizo Bend, Arizona Territory, a woman stood on the auction block with a flour sack over her head, and not one man in that crowd would pay $10 for her. They had paid more for mules that same hour. They had paid more for a stove with a cracked door. But the woman with the sack over her head stood in the sun while the auctioneer talked himself hoarse, and the crowd held its money like it might catch fire in their pockets, because every soul in Carrizo Bend had heard what was said to be hiding under that sack. Some said her face would turn milk. Some said her face would turn luck. Some said a man in Prescott had lifted that sack once and was dead before the snow came. Nobody knew her name. Nobody had asked it. And then, from the back of the crowd, a man stepped forward whom the town feared very nearly as much as it feared whatever stood on that block. And what he did in the next 5 minutes would shame Carrizo Bend for a generation. His name was Silas Yarrow, and he lived alone up Cane Spring Canyon. And there was a story about him too, a story with a dead man in it. The town believed it had 2 monsters in the square that morning. The town was wrong about the count and wrong about the monsters. And before this tale is finished, you will know what was truly under that sack, what was truly behind that man's silence, and why, years later, children in that same square would beg to touch the very thing the town had once paid not to look at. Before we ride up that canyon together, let me ask one small favor. If a woman sold under a flour sack already has a hook in your heart, take a second and subscribe, and tap the bell so the next story finds you. And do me a kindness in the comments. Tell me what town you're listening from tonight. I read every one. Now then, back to the square, back to the dust, back to the moment the bidding died. The auctioneer was a long-necked man named Rance Ogletree, and he had a voice that could sell rain to a drowning man. But it was failing him now. He had moved a wagon, a plow, 6 mules, and a crate of window glass that morning, and the crowd had been merry through all of it. And then his men had brought out the woman, and the merriment had gone out of the square like water through sand. She wore a gray dress gone thin at the elbows. Her wrists were tied in front of her with a pigging string, and the flour sack sat crooked on her head, and through the weave of it, if a man looked, he could see the shape of her breathing. Ogletree called her a bride. He called it a marriage arrangement, lawful and Christian, a debt settled and a wife gained, all in one signature. He did not call it what it was.
What it was a sale. He started her at $100, and the square gave him nothing but wind. He came down to 80, to 60, to 40, talking faster as he fell, and a man near the front spat and said he wouldn't take her at gunpoint, said his sister in Tucson had written him about the girl with the devil's mark, said the Finn girl had buried her own father with that face, and the ground hadn't wanted him. A few men laughed, the way men laugh when they are afraid and grateful to be in a crowd about it. Up on the block, the woman's tied hands closed slowly into fists, and that was all. She did not sway. She did not beg. She stood the way a fence post stands in a flood.
Ogletree wet his thumb and smoothed his left eyebrow flat, a small motion, quick as a lizard, and any man who had done business with Rance Ogletree could have told you that he never touched that eyebrow except when a lie was on its way out of him. And he opened his mouth to say that the talk of a mark was pure invention, and a voice from the back of the crowd said, 60! The square turned as one animal. Silas Yarrow stood at the edge of the boardwalk with his hat in his hand, which was strange because men did not generally remove their hats to bid on livestock. He was a big man gone lean, dark-bearded, sun-cured, dressed in clothes that had been mended by their owner with more patience than skill. The town knew him the way a town knows a far-off thunderhead. He came down out of Cane Spring Canyon 4 times a year for salt, shoeing iron, and cartridges, paid in clean money, spoke perhaps a dozen words a visit, and went back up.
And behind him, wherever he went, trailed the old story from the freight camps, that 9 years back, on the Hassayampa Road, Silas Yarrow had beaten a man with his bare hands, and that the man had lain down 3 days after and died of it. No court had ever touched him. That made it worse in the town's arithmetic. A hanged man is a closed ledger. A walking one is an open question. $60, Silas said again into the silence. That's the debt figure you posted on the church door, Ogletree. 60 even. I'm not bidding on a woman. I'm settling a debt and the paper that comes with it." Ogletree's eyes went small and bright, the eyes of a man watching a prophet and a problem walk toward him wearing the same boots. The debt paper belonged to Garland Mott, a stock dealer out of the river country, and Mott had been very particular about who might end up holding it. But $60 in hand on a Saturday is a persuasive theology, and the crowd was watching, and Ogletree was a creature of crowds. He smoothed his eyebrow once more, called 60 a fair Christian sum, and cried, "Her sold." What happened next, the town would argue about for years. Silas Yarrow crossed the square, and the crowd opened in front of him, the way grass opens for a snake, and he stopped below the block and looked up at the woman in the sack, and he did not reach for the sack. Every man there expected him to reach for the sack. He had paid $60. The lifting of the sack was, by the crowd's reckoning, the whole purchase. Instead, he took out a folding knife, and the crowd drew one breath all together, and he cut the pigging string off her wrists and folded the knife and put it away. "You can take that off whenever it suits you," he said to her, quietly, but the square was so still that quiet carried. "Or never. It's yours to decide. Can you ride?"
Under the sack, after a moment, the woman nodded. He helped her down off the block by the elbow, the way a man helps his grandmother over an icy doorstep, and walked her to his horses. And the whole of Carrizo Bend watched the two of them ride out, the killer from Cane Spring and the cursed bride, the man no one would cross, and the woman no one would buy. And not one soul in that square had the smallest notion that they had just witnessed the beginning of the only love story their town would ever be famous for. Though one man, watching from the shade of the freight office with a cold cigar in his teeth, already had his own notions, and his notions had rope in them. They rode the canyon road without a word between them. That has to be understood about both of these people from the start. Silence was not, for either one, an emptiness. It was a country they had each lived in alone for years, and now they found themselves traveling it together. Two strangers astonished to meet anyone else who knew the roads. 10 miles up, where the cottonwoods began and Cane Spring came down cold over Red Rock, his place stood in a bend of the canyon, a stone and timber cabin, a barn wanting shingles, corrals, a garden patch gone to weeds, and beyond it, grass and horses, maybe 30 head, that lifted their heads all together when they heard him coming. He stepped down and held her stirrup, and when she was on the ground, he stood back a full 3 paces, which she noticed because she had 2 years of hard schooling in how close men chose to stand. "My name is Silas Yarrow," he said. "I expect you heard things about me in that square. Some of them are true. Here is what's also true. There are 2 rooms in that cabin, and the one with the bolt on the inside of the door is yours. The bolt is new. I put it on last night after I read the notice on the church door because I figured whoever came off that block would want a door that answered to her and nobody else. I'll not touch you. I'll not ask your story. You'll have work because everything alive up here works, but you'll have wages of a kind too. Food, safety, and time. If a day comes you want to leave, I'll outfit you and see you safe to wherever you name, and the paper I bought gets burned either way. I bought a debt, not a person. A person can't be bought. My mother taught me that, and she was right about nearly everything." The woman stood very still. Then her hands came up, and she took hold of the flour sack and lifted it off. She was perhaps 20 and would have been called uncommonly pretty in any town that had not been taught otherwise, with brown hair come loose from its pins and gray eyes that had learned to watch a man's hands before his face. And across her left cheek, from the corner of her eye down nearly to her jaw, lay a birthmark the color of strong tea. A broad, branching stain, darker at the center, feathered at the edges, the kind of mark that midwives in old countries had 100 names for, and not one kind one. This was the devil's mark of Carrizo Bend. This was the curse that had emptied a square of its money, a patch of darker skin on a frightened girl's face. "Lila," she said. Her voice was low and a little rusted, the voice of someone who had gone a long time without anyone worth spending it on. "Lila Fenn. My father was Amos Fenn. He hauled freight out of Missouri and he died on the trail last spring, and everything that's happened to me since has happened because of this." She touched her cheek, briefly, the way you'd touch a stove you knew was hot. "You'll want to know if the stories are true, whether I curse what I look at." "I want to know if you can cook beans without scorching them," Silas said.
"Because I cannot, and I have been eating my own scorched beans for 11 years, and that, Miss Fenn, is the only curse presently operating on this property." And Lila Fenn, who had not laughed since Missouri, made a small, broken sound that was trying to remember how to be a laugh, and turned quickly toward the cabin so he would not see her face do what it did next. That night she bolted her door and lay listening, the way she had learned to listen. The cabin made its noises, timber ticking as it cooled, a horse blowing out in the dark, wind combing the cottonwoods, and one sound more. Footsteps on the porch, slow, even, passing and returning, until almost dawn. Her heart hammered at first, then she understood. He was not pacing at her door. He was walking the watch, with a rifle, facing out at the canyon, guarding the road, which meant Silas Yarrow believed somebody would be coming up it.
The first weeks were a long, careful negotiation, conducted almost entirely without words. Lila cooked, and she had not lied. She could make a kingdom out of beans, salt pork, and bad flour. And the first night she set biscuits in front of him that rose light as gossip. Silas ate 4 in a silence so reverent it counted as an oration. She mended what wanted mending, which on that ranch was most things. He, in turn, learned her weather the way he learned a green horse's, when to come near, when to stand off, never to come up on her left side without speaking first, because her marked side was her blind side in more ways than one, and a shape appearing sudden in that corner of her eye made her flinch like a struck dog. He saw the flinch once. He never caused it again. She kept the sack those first weeks.
Not over her head, but folded on the shelf by her bed, the way a freed man might keep his chains. And when work took her outside, she wore her hair pulled forward and her bonnet angled, a curtain perpetually drawn over the left half of her face. Silas said nothing about it, but she noticed that when they spoke, he looked at her square and whole, both sides at once, his eyes never sliding to the mark, and never sliding away from it either. And she had not known until then that there was a third way for eyes to behave. She noticed other things. That the dead man's story the town told had a shape he carried in his shoulders, that on a beam inside the barn, low down where you'd only see it pitching hay, a name had been cut with a knife, years ago by the gray of it, Davy, and under the name, a date, and Silas's eyes went over it every time he passed the way a tongue goes over a broken tooth. She did not ask. She was a debtor's daughter. She knew about ledgers a person cannot bear to open. The roof brought them their first real hour. An April storm came down the canyon one evening like something with shoulders, and the barn's bare patch drank rain straight onto the hay, and the two of them spent half the night up on the wet shingles together in the lantern light, her holding nails and cedar shakes, him hammering, both of them soaked and shouting small, necessary words over the wind. Left, hold it, 2 more. And somewhere past midnight the storm quit all at once, the way Arizona storms do, and they sat back on the ridge line of the barn, dripping, breathless, and below them the canyon smelled like rain on hot stone, which is the smell hope would have if hope had a smell. Lila's bonnet had blown off an hour before, her hair was plastered flat, and the mark stood plain on her wet cheek in the lantern light, and she realized she had forgotten it. For 1 entire hour of her life, she had forgotten it. "My father had a saying," she said, before she knew she meant to speak. The lantern hissed. "He'd say it when I cried over what people called me. He'd take my chin and he'd say, 'Lila bird, a mark like yours only ever frightens the small.' He said big souls read it like a map of some place they'd like to go." Silas looked at the mark, openly, the way you look at country you're being introduced to. "He was right," he said. "It's a map, all right." And he said nothing more, and did not say what country he saw in it. And climbing down the ladder afterward, Lila found her hands were unsteady, and could not honestly tell herself it was the cold. Inside, by the stove, she did a thing she had done every night of her life since the trail. She took from her dress pocket a brass button,
big as a two-bit piece, worn smooth as creekstone, with the last ghost of an eagle stamped on it, the top button of her father's old coat, the coat he'd died in, the only object on this earth that was hers and had been his. She warmed it in her fist. Silas, drying his hands across the room, saw it and asked nothing, and because he asked nothing, she told him everything. The trail, the lung fever, the grave scraped out of March ground in New Mexico territory, her father's hand going cold around hers while his lips still moved on her name. She cut the button off the coat before strangers took the coat. It was the size of the inheritance the world had left her. One brass button. Then it's the wealthiest object in this canyon, Silas said, and we'll treat it accordingly. She slept that night without bolting her door. She did not plan it. She simply forgot. And in the morning, the unbolted door frightened her worse than any stranger could have, because forgetting to be afraid was a luxury she could not afford. And events were already moving down in the river country to prove her right. Because the same week the roof was mended, a man named Garland Mott learned where his $60 had come from, and who was keeping what he still called, to anyone who'd listen, his property. She had not told Silas about Mott. That was the room in her she kept bolted. But every story we won't tell knows its own road to our door, and hers arrived on the first Saturday of May, when they came down to Carrizo Bend together for salt, sugar, and shoeing iron. The town did its arithmetic on them the moment they crossed onto the main street. Women gathered children against their skirts as Lila passed, not even unkindly, just automatically, the way you'd step around a snake without hating it. The blacksmith served Silas with his eyes anywhere but on the woman by the door. In Tatum's Mercantile, a drummer fresh off the stage took one look at her cheek, went the color of suet, and discovered urgent business in the street. Lila bore it the way she bore weather. But at the counter, the storekeeper's daughter, a square-built, gap-toothed girl of 7 called Dilly, short for Cordelia, a child famous from one end of town to the other for saying out loud whatever the grown folks were busy not saying, leaned over the pickle barrel, studied Lila's face with the frank thoroughness of her age, and announced, "It looks like a tree, like a big old tree with all its branches. Why does everybody act scared of a tree?" "Cordelia," her mother hissed, scarlet. "It's all right," Lila said. And to the child, "I don't know, Dilly. Why do you suppose?" Dilly considered the question with her whole body, the way children do.
"I guess their souls is little," she said at last, with a shrug that dismissed half the town, and went back to the pickles, and never knew she had handed a grown woman back a piece of her own father. They were loading the wagon when the 3 riders came up the street. Lila saw them first. Saw them the way prey sees, all at once and down to the boot leather, and Silas felt her go wrong beside him, felt it before he saw anything, the way you feel a horse bunch under you before the buck. The man in the middle rode a tall copper gelding and wore a coat too heavy for the season because the coat was the point. He was fleshy, ginger-whiskered, prosperous, with small, pale eyes, and as he rode he was turning something over and over in one hand, a silver watch, weighing it, and when his gaze crossed the people on the boardwalk, you could watch it do the same thing to each of them in turn, weighing, pricing. Garland Mott did not look at faces. Faces were not where the money was. He stopped the gelding by the wagon and looked at Lila the way a man looks at a horse he used to own. "Well," he said, "there she is. You've cost me a deal of trouble, girl." Then to Silas, pleasantly, pricingly, "Garland Mott, I expect the ladies mentioned me. No? Well, she and I have history, and history, friend, has interest accruing. Ogletree had no authority to take your 60. That paper was mine, and the arrangement attached to it was mine, and I've come to make it square. I'll hand you back your 60, and 20 for your inconvenience, and we'll say no more about it." He weighed the watch. "Everything's for sale at the right figure. I have found that to be the one reliable scripture." "The debt's paid and the paper's ash," Silas said. "I burned it on my own hearth. There's nothing here of yours." Mott smiled, and the smile never got anywhere near the small, pale eyes. "Yarrow, isn't it? Out of the freight camps. Oh, I know your story, friend. Whole territory knows it." He raised his voice just enough to put it on the public record of the street. You want this town remembering what your hands did on the Hassayampa? You want them remembering it while a woman lives up that canyon alone with you? He let that sit. Then, softly, only for them, I'll be back for what's mine. I'm a patient man. Patience is just interest, accruing. He turned the gelding without waiting on an answer, and his two riders fell in behind, and the street watched them go and then watched Silas and Lila with new and busy eyes. The ride home was 12 miles of silence with a stone in it. At the canyon mouth, Lila finally said, to the dusk, "He held my father's debt note. After Papa died, he came to the camp and said the debt could be settled another way. He had a preacher with him, Silas, bought and paid for, drunk by noon. When I refused him, he started the talk, the mark, the curse. He's the one who said I'd killed my father with my face. Mott said it first, and the trail folks carried it, and it got to every town ahead of me like a rider. He made me unsaleable to anyone but himself, you see. He poisoned the whole market and then waited for the price to fall to him. The auction was his idea. Ogletree just took a fee. Mott meant to be the only bidder." Her hands were white on the wagon seat. "And then you." Silas drove a while. "The man I'm said to have killed," he said at last, the first time he had ever walked toward that story rather than away, "was a freight boss named Dutch Kyle, and he had a way with the camp boys, with a doubled trace chain. One of those boys was 14. He stopped there, jaw shut, the rest of it locked behind the name on the barn beam, and Lila did not push, because she could hear there was a deeper room behind that one. "What I'll say is this. I know Mott's breed. I've known it since I was young enough to be priced by it.
And it never sends a letter before it comes. It just comes. So from tonight, we live like weather's making up. Behind them, far down the darkening road, a single rider sat his horse at the canyon mouth, watching them climb, and did not follow. He didn't need to. He had been sent to learn one thing only: how many guns lived up Cane Spring Canyon. And the answer he carried back to the river country was 1. The waves came the way Silas had said they would. No letter, just weather. The first wave was small enough to deny. Riders on the canyon rim at dusk, 2 or 3, sitting their horses against the sky just long enough to be seen seeing. A week of that. Then the spring box at Cane Spring fouled with a dead coyote that had not crawled in there by itself, and the two of them hauling clean water from up canyon for days while Silas burned and relaid the box. Then the garden. The garden Lila had pulled back row by row from the weeds all that spring, trampled in a night to green pulp by horses whose tracks walked in from the road and walked back out again, unhurried. After the garden, Lila stood in the ruined rows in the early light, and Silas came and stood beside her, and she said, in a voice scraped down to the wood, "It's me they're costing you. Set me on the stage at Maricopa, and this all stops. You go back to your peace." "I had 11 years of that peace," Silas said. "I'd not trade one of your scorch-mouthed remarks about my coffee for the whole 11. And anyhow, you've got it backwards. Mott's not raising the price on me to make me quit you. He's raising it to teach the territory what quitting you costs, so no one ever bids against him on anything again. Men like him don't want the money. They want the lesson. We're not going to be his lesson." She looked at him then, full and straight, and something passed over her face that was not gratitude, was older and stranger and warmer than gratitude, and frightened her so thoroughly that she went inside and kneaded bread dough like it had personally fouled the spring. The second wave came for her alone, a still, white-hot June morning. Silas gone up the far pasture after a lame mare. Lila walking the half-mile down to the lower bend where the wild plums grew. They came out of the cottonwoods so quietly that the first she knew was the rope. It came over her shoulders and snugged her arms to her sides, and a horse backed and the rope sang taut, and a man she'd never seen laughed low and said, "Easy now, easy," to her, the words you say to stock, and a second man brought up a led mule with an empty pack saddle, and that detail, the pack saddle, the planning in it, the freight of it, turned her fear to something hotter.
She got her boot heel into the roper's instep when he came to lift her, and her elbow into his throat as he doubled, and she was 3 steps into the plum thicket when the second man's rope came down and missed, and then the morning cracked open. The sound a Sharp's rifle makes in a stone canyon is the canyon's own opinion of you, delivered all at once. The ball took the pack saddle clean off the mule's back at 200 yards. Up on the red rim, hatless against the white sky, stood Silas Yarrow, already reloaded, and he did not shout a warning because the shot had been the warning, and the next silence asked a simple question. The 2 men chose to live. They left at a gallop, leaving the rope still on her, and Silas came down off that rim faster than a man safely can, and crossed the flat at a dead run, and then, 3 steps from her, stopped, stood, breathed, and reached out and lifted the rope away as gently as if it were a snake asleep, and his hands, she saw, those famous hands, were shaking. "I'm all right," she said. "I know it," he said, in ruins. She reached up, first time, her choice, her hand, and laid her palm flat on his chest, on the hammer going inside there, and they stood that way in the plum shade a long minute, 2 people learning that the wall between them had been load-bearing and that something would now have to be built quickly in its place. That night he told her the rest. They sat on the porch step with the rifle across his knees, and he said, "The boy Dutch Kyle whipped was my brother, Davy, 14 and slow, not simple, just gentle in a way the camps eat. I'd signed us both on after our folks went, told him I'd stand between him and the world. Then I took a 3-day haul for double wages and left him, and Kyle had 3 days." The lantern fizzed. "What I did to Kyle when I got back, I won't dress up. I meant it. He died of it Sunday. No law came. The camps bury their own arithmetic. But Davy took a fever that winter, weak as the beating left him, and I hauled him in a wagon 90 miles toward a doctor at Wickenburg, and he died 14 miles short, at sunup, asking me whether the trace chains could reach him where he was going. I told him no. It's the only time I ever lied to him." Silas looked out at the dark. "Town's right to fear my hands, Lila. They've done murder, or near enough that the difference is for preachers, but they've never once touched a thing that didn't have it coming, and they would come off at the wrist before they'd touch you wrong. I needed you to know the whole of it. A person ought to know what's standing watch on her porch." Lila was quiet a moment. Then she took the brass button from her pocket, her whole estate, and pressed it into his scarred right hand and folded his fingers over it. "Carry that on watch," she said. "Papa's coat stood between me and every cold thing for 20 years. It can keep doing it. And Silas, about your hands." She waited until he looked at her. "It only frightens the small." Far down the canyon, a coyote called, and another answered, and one of the 2 was no coyote. Silas's fingers closed around the button. The 3rd wave was coming, and they both knew it would not come by daylight. It came 9 nights later, at the dark of the moon, and it came as fire. Lila woke to orange light moving wrong on her ceiling and the horses screaming in the corral, and she was up and dressed in the time it takes to fall and met Silas in the front room, already armed. The barn's south wall wore a sheet of flame. Between the fire and the cabin sat 6 riders, and out front of them on the tall copper gelding, coat and all at midnight, Garland Mott, with Rance Ogletree beside him, looking like a man who had discovered too late which business he was actually in. "Yarrow!" Mott's voice came easy across the yard, a man conducting a foreclosure. "Barn's the first figure. The house is the second. Send the girl out and we ride off and you can still save your stock. Everything's for sale, friend. Tonight, you're selling." What Mott had planned for was a man alone, choosing between his life's work and a woman he'd known 3 months. What Mott had not planned for was that Silas Yarrow had spent 9 years learning every stone of that canyon in the dark, or that the woman would refuse the bolt hole he'd shown her and stand at the window with the shotgun she'd made him teach her, white-faced and steady, or that the burning barn would light Mott's men up like figures on a stage while the cabin's stone face stayed black. And there was one more thing in motion that midnight that neither Mott nor Silas knew.
A storekeeper's daughter named Dilly, sleepless in town 12 miles off, had seen the glow on the northern sky and hollered her father out of bed. And Tatum, the storekeeper, had read that glow, and the direction of it, and his own conscience, all in the same minute. And Carrizo Bend, which had watched a woman sold in its square without lifting a hand, was at that hour saddling horses in the dark, 15 strong, with the sheriff swearing at the front because witnesses were coming whether he came or not. In the yard, Mott tired of waiting and sent 3 men at the door, and the night came apart. Silas fired low and legged the first man at 20 feet. Lila's shotgun took the hat and the courage off the second. The third made the porch and the door and met Silas's hands.
The town's 2 stories about Cane Spring Canyon collided on that porch in the firelight, and the truth of both stood up at once. The hands were every bit as terrible as the legend said, and they were terrible on behalf of someone, which the legend had never once mentioned. The man went off the porch boards like a sack of grain and did not ask to come back up. Mott, watching his arithmetic fail, did what his breed does when the ledger turns, reached for the gun, not for the man, but past him, swinging the muzzle toward the lit window, toward the woman, toward the merchandise he'd sooner ruin than lose. And Silas Yarrow stepped off the porch into the open ground between the gun and the window, arms wide, making of his own body the only wall left, and shouted the one word, her name, and the night answered with hooves.
15 riders of Carrizo Bend came up the canyon road into the firelight, and Mott's gun hung in the air with the whole town watching it. And that is the precise difference between a predator and a businessman. The predator would have fired. Mott priced the moment and folded. The sheriff took his pistol, took his men, and took, because Ogletree, wetting his thumb and smoothing his eyebrow one last useless time, began trading testimony before his feet touched the ground, the entire architecture of the thing. How the debt note Mott carried was paper fraud. Amos Fenn's freight account settled in full at Santa Fe 2 weeks before he died, the receipt on file in the company ledger, and Mott had known it, had bet that a dead man's daughter under a flour sack would never get to a ledger. How the curse talk had been seeded town by town, paid for in whiskey, a market poisoned by the only bitter.
The reckoning was honest, which is to say slow, dull, and made of paper. A trial at the county seat that autumn, fraud and arson and attempted abduction, and Garland Mott went to the territorial prison at Yuma, where, it was reported back with some satisfaction, everything was indeed for sale, and he had nothing left to bid with. But the night of the fire ended before any of that, in the smoking yard at gray dawn, with the barn half saved by a bucket line of the same hands that had once held tight to their money in the square. And as the townsmen worked, Lila Finn came out of the cabin among them with her hair loose and her face bare, the mark plain in the morning light, and went down the bucket line passing water, and one by one the men of Carrizo Bend looked at the devil's mark at arm's length, sweating and sooty, and found it was a birthmark on a brave woman's face, and that they were the ones who couldn't meet her eyes. It was Dilly, arrived at sunup in her father's wagon, who closed the account. She walked straight to Lila through all those silent men and looked up at the tea-colored branches on her cheek and said, loud, in the voice of a child saying what grown folks are busy not saying, "I knew it was a tree. See, it's a tree, and they tried to burn it down, and it wouldn't burn." And the bucket line laughed, at itself mostly, which is the only laughter that ever cures a town, and somewhere in that laughter the curse of Carrizo Bend quietly died of natural causes. Silas found Lila by the corral after, in the new sun. He was burned along one forearm and would not yet admit it, and he held out his closed hand and opened it, the brass button, sooted, that had ridden in his breast pocket through the whole of the night. "Stood its watch," he said. "So did you." Lila. He turned the button over once, the old eagle catching light.
"I bought a debt in that square because I couldn't stomach the sight of the sale. I never bought what came home with me, and I never will, because it isn't for buying, and I've known that longer than I've had words for it. So I've got no figure to offer. All I have is the canyon, the horses, the hands you know the history of, and every watch I've got left to stand. If that's enough, then I'm asking, properly, with your father's button for the asking, since I own nothing finer." She took the button. She took the burned hand, too. "Papa would say you overpaid," she said, and her face did at last, in full daylight, in front of God and the horses, the thing it had been trying to do since the night on the barn roof. "I say the deal stands." They were married in September in the square at Carrizo Bend, her doing that choice of ground, and the town understood it was being both forgiven and instructed, and took the instruction. She wore no veil.
She stood on very nearly the spot where the auction block had stood, barefaced in the long gold light, and the preacher, a real one, sober, said the words, and where a crowd had once held its money, it now held its hats, and the wind that crossed the square that evening carried wood smoke and bread from the church social tables, the smell of a town sitting down to eat with itself. The years went up the canyon after that the way the seasons do, each one carrying something. The barn rose again, bigger, and the garden came back, and the horses multiplied, and yarrow stock got a name as far as Tucson. A daughter came in the second year, and they called her Marta for Silas's mother. A son 2 years on, and they called him Amos. And last, a small, late surprise of a girl whom Silas wanted to call Cordelia, after the child who had seen a tree where a town saw a devil, and Lila laughed and allowed it. And so there was a second Dilly in the country, to the vast pride of the first.
Marta was born with her mother's gray eyes and clear cheeks, Amos likewise. But the youngest came into the world with a small tea-colored feathering at her temple, faint as a watermark, and the midwife went still when she saw it, old country still, and looked at Lila with the question her grandmother would have asked. And Lila took her daughter and kissed the mark before the cord was cold, and said, "Well now, she's got the map too." That was the whole of the discussion, then or ever, because here is what the children of Cane Spring Canyon grew up knowing, as plainly as they knew the way to the spring, that their mother's cheek carried a great branching tree, and that tracing its branches with a small finger at bedtime was a privilege to be negotiated and traded among them like marbles. That their father, the biggest and quietest man in their world, had hands the county spoke of carefully, and that those hands could split a cedar round at a stroke and also remove one moth from a lamp chimney without dusting its wings. That above the cradle, every cradle in turn, for it moved to the newest yarrow as a matter of law, there hung on a loop of wang leather a single brass button, worn smooth as creek stone, an eagle almost gone from its face, and that it had belonged to a grandfather who died on the trail with his daughter's name on his lips, and had stood watch over every yarrow since. And that when anyone in that family met meanness in the world, a schoolyard word, a stranger's stare, a small soul doing what small souls do, there was a thing you said, quietly, the way you'd hand somebody a canteen. Their mother said it first, and her father before her, and by now half of Carrizo Bend said it too, mostly without knowing where they'd caught it. It only frightens the small. On a June evening many years on, Lila Yarrow stood in her doorway at dusk and watched her husband come up from the corrals through the cottonwoods, gray in his beard now, a granddaughter asleep on his shoulder, and behind them the canyon breathed out its evening smell of water on hot stone. In the house at her back, above the cradle, the brass button turned slowly on its leather string in the lamplight, the way it always turned when the door stood open to the wind. The same wind, if you go back far enough, that had crossed a dusty square one Saturday in 1871 and stirred the corner of a flour sack while a town held its breath and its money. It had been a hard wind that day, full of grit and other people's verdicts.
It came up the canyon, now soft as a hand on a bridle, carrying supper smoke and the sound of children, and Lila stood in it, barefaced, the great tree on her cheek silvering in the last light, frightening no one at all, for there was no one small left on that whole place to frighten. And that is the story of Silas and Lila Yarrow, the man a town feared and the woman a town sold, who turned out to be the two safest souls in the territory to love. Thank you for riding the canyon road with me tonight. I'd dearly love to know where this story found you. Drop your town in the comments below and tell me, did Dilly's tree get you the way it got me? If this tale warmed you, subscribe and ring the bell so the next one can find its way to your fire. Until our trails cross again, friend, may your watch be quiet and your door answer only to you.